You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Elections Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's September 1931 at a restaurant on West 22nd Street on Coney Island in Brooklyn, New York. A man in his late 50s is on the restaurant payphone. He's irate. The woman on the other end of the line, his employee Sue, tries her best to sweet-talk him. "Louie, dear." "Never mind that dear stuff." Cockeyed Lou isn't in the mood for games today. Sue was late for a meeting, and in Lou's line of work, tardiness is not tolerated. "Look here, Sue. When you were sent over there, you were told to be there at 12 noon. "I know, Lou, but 12 noon. Not 1, not 1:30. And I don't give a good goddamn for that cocksucker Joe, the bastard. I don't care if he's your sweetheart. That son of a bitch doesn't know nothing about this business. And you can tell him I don't give a damn for him or his 6 girls. I have more girls than he ever thought of." Sue tries her best to defuse the situation. "Now, is that any way to talk to a lady? Maybe you don't want me to work for you no more." Lou's patience is wearing thin, but he tries his best to keep his anger under control and to articulate to Sue that if she doesn't get her act together, there will be consequences. "Sue, you are a very nice girl, and I sure do like you. But I don't like trouble. Arguments and fights. It don't pay in this game." "Well, I'm not going to work for you anymore then." "And I don't give a damn." Lou is at the end of his rope, and Sue knows it. She also knows this isn't the sort of job a girl can just walk away from. So immediately, she walks back her limp thread. "No, Lou, honey, I'm only fooling. Everything will be all right. You'll see. Will you come and see us soon?" Louis Weiner, also known as Cockeyed Lou, was part of a vast network of pimps, madams, and prostitutes. On that day in September 1931, Lou had no idea that the police were listening to his conversation on a wiretap. In July of 1931, the cops received an anonymous letter pointing them in the direction of a prostitution ring. Within weeks, the police were surveilling Cockeyed Lou, and by September, they had a wiretap up at one of his regular haunts, a restaurant in Coney Island. It didn't take long for Cockeyed Lou to lead the cops to the real boss of his criminal enterprise, Charles Lucky Luciano. Eventually, a transcript of one of the tap conversations made its way to the desk of a young, intrepid New York prosecutor named Thomas Dewey. Dewey's fight against organized crime in New York would catapult him to national stardom and position him as the de facto leader of the Republican Party in the election of 1948. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham. and this is American Elections Wicked Game. In the 1930s, organized crime was rampant, and taking on the mob in New York was a dangerous proposition. But New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey was not one to run from a fight. Dewey's investigation and subsequent prosecution of mobster Lucky Luciano helped launch his political career. Dewey's rise in Republican politics was meteoric. Dewey would serve as U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, District Attorney for New York County, the Governor of New York, and finally, the Republican nominee for president in 1944. Though Dewey lost that election to FDR, he did not lose his status inside his party. In the 1948 contest, Dewey would again try for the White House. But to take back the presidency for the Republicans, Dewey would first have to rise to the top of a crowded field of potential nominees and challenge an incumbent president fighting through a barrage of opposition. This is episode 41, 1948. Dewey versus Truman versus Thurmond versus Wallace. Gangbuster. For a time, Harry Truman was a popular president, in large part because of his leadership during the latter part of World War II. By May of 1945, Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, and the Axis powers had crumbled, save for Japan, which fought on alone. Worried that an invasion of Japan would be too costly in American lives, Truman resorted to other methods. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the newly developed atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. Days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Truman's fateful decision brought a swift end to the war, but it also had unintended consequences. The American economy struggled to adjust to the abrupt peacetime. Inflation spiked, taxes remained high, prices soared even as wages stagnated, and labor unrest grew more ubiquitous. Overseas, the wartime coalition between the United States and the USSR broke apart as Eastern Europe fell under the control of the Soviets. The ensuing Cold War between the Free West and the Communist East left many Americans fearful that America's enemies might develop an atomic bomb of their own, and many Americans laid the blame for all of this at Truman's feet. Going into the 1946 midterms, Republicans across the country ran on a simple but effective campaign slogan in the form of a question: had enough? Another pun, to err is Truman, and the Republicans' anti-Truman campaign worked. In the 1946 midterms, Republicans trounced the Democrats. The GOP won back the House and the Senate. To further check the Democrats, the Republican-controlled Congress pushed through the 22nd Amendment, which limited a president to 2 terms, a direct shot at the late Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And going into the 1948 contest, Republicans saw further opportunity and a means to put an end to the Democrats' long-standing presidential winning streak. The man many hoped would lead the charge against Harry Truman was New York Governor Thomas Dewey. Dewey announced his candidacy in January of 1948. In the minds of many, Dewey, a political moderate, was a perfect foil to Truman. Though Truman and Dewey largely agreed on foreign policy, Dewey was much more conservative in his approach to domestic affairs. But though Dewey was the frontrunner in the minds of many, he was not the first candidate in the race. 2 major Republicans had already declared: Senator Robert Taft, the son of America's 27th President William Howard Taft, and Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota. And both men gave Dewey plenty of cause for concern. Taft had a sharp intellect, a famous last name, and a nickname that matched his classically conservative persona, Mr. Republican. Taft was a tried and true conservative, and with the rising tension of the Cold War looming, Taft ran his campaign on an isolationist platform, which drew a sharper contrast with Truman. But Harold Stassen was the more immediate threat. In the arena of Republican politics, Dewey was accustomed to being the young, fresh-faced candidate going up against men decades his senior. Harold Stassen, though, was 5 years Dewey's junior. Stassen's youthful energy earned him the nickname Boy Governor. And because Dewey and Stassen were not far apart politically, to win the nomination, Dewey would have to have more vim and vigor than Stassen in the Republican primary. The primary system in the 1940s looked very different from the one used today. Now, candidates win delegates in the various state primaries. Those delegates are bound to vote for that candidate at the party convention. In the 1940s, most delegates were not chosen by popular vote. They were chosen by party leaders in the individual states. Only a small portion of delegate votes were actually decided by the primary contests, so the nomination was still won or lost at the conventions. But in 1948, the primary contests still held significance. They were a way for candidates to test the viability of their message with the people. If a candidate performed well, it could create momentum going into the summer convention. If they fell flat, often their candidacy would fizzle. Dewey ran a deft primary campaign. While ingratiating himself to party leaders in the various states, Dewey was the polished face of a well-orchestrated PR campaign. His time fighting the mob in New York had taught him what he believed was a valuable lesson about being in the public eye. Restraint is better than passion. Passion might put people off. Calm restraint would give them confidence. And Dewey's manner gave party leaders the confidence to line his pockets with campaign funds, which Dewey used on carefully crafted ads in newspapers, magazines, and the radio. Dewey was always careful with his words, fully aware that saying the wrong thing might cost him the nomination. Stassen, on the other hand, was never shy about speaking his mind. He had a natural charm and charisma, and he was not afraid to break the mold. Stassen had announced his candidacy back in 1946, 2 years before the election, extremely early in this time. Stassen was arguably the first ever presidential candidate to launch a door-to-door canvassing campaign. According to Life magazine, in the early part of 1948, Stassen traveled 6,000 miles, knocking on doors and talking directly to the people. He recruited a staff of eager college students to help him canvass. He raised loads of money. He articulated his opinions to the press, and he was on the rise. And though Dewey won the first primary contest in New Hampshire, Stassen won a handful of delegates and for many was gaining momentum. Stassen won the next 2 primaries in Wisconsin and Nebraska, and not long after the Nebraska primary, a Gallup poll showed Stassen well ahead of Thomas Dewey nationwide. For the Dewey campaign, the true primary test was in Oregon on May 21, 1948. For Dewey, it was do or die. If Stassen won, Dewey might have to withdraw. Politically, Stassen and Dewey were not too differentiated. On domestic issues, both took a moderate approach. But they differed on at least one question, though: how best to fight the rise of communism at home. Largely derived from the thinking of Karl Marx, communism is a political ideology based on common ownership, or rather state ownership, of the means of production and absence of social classes. For most Americans in the late 1940s, the term communism was synonymous with the Soviet Union. That meant a stifling, centrally planned state economy and a government-controlled society absent of many personal liberties that Americans held dear. As such, communism was largely considered anti-American. And as with the USSR's growing influence on other nations, Americans came to view the Communist Party of the United States with skepticism, fear, and often hysteria. So for many primary voters in 1948, both Republicans and Democrats, communism was a major campaign issue, perhaps the issue. For weeks, Stassen had been pressing Dewey to meet him in a debate. Dewey had done his best to avoid it, worried that Stassen's charm would easily overcome his taciturn nature. But with the nomination on the line, Dewey finally accepted. Days before the Oregon primary, the restrained Dewey loosened his lips. He took on the subject of communism and used it as a weapon to try and knock Stassen out of the race. It's May 17, 1948, at a radio station in Portland, Oregon. On one side of a glass wall, over 50 reporters cram inside a small studio. On the other side, 2 candidates sit in front of a microphone, preparing to spar.
You are about to hear a debate between Governor Thomas E. Dewey and Harold E. Stassen, candidates for the Republican nomination to the presidency of the United States.
The question on the table is this: should the Communist Party be outlawed in the United States? Governor Stassen leads off and argues the affirmative.
The free countries must take action to protect themselves against this fifth column in this unsettled period, which has been called a Cold War.
Stassen emphasizes the point that the Communist Party, if unchecked, might be used as a weapon by the Soviet government.
There's now no law in America to prevent these communist organizations from secretly developing organizations of hidden members, from carrying on secret conspiracies to promote strikes, to stir up hatred between races and religions in America, and from following their directions from Moscow.
As Stassen wraps up his affirmative argument, he's confident he's made his case, and Thomas Dewey is nervous. Stassen's campaign has been picking up steam and winning primaries. If Dewey loses this debate, he may very well lose the Republican nomination. As he lays out his negative argument, Dewey emphasizes that suppressing communism is not the answer.
My interest is in preserving this country from being destroyed by the development of an underground organization which would grow so colossally in strength were it outlawed that it might easily destroy our country and cause us to draft all of the young men in the nation.
Dewey believes that the best way to kill communism is to force communists out into the open and win the war of ideas. As he wraps up his argument against outlawing communism, Dewey appeals to the constitutional conservatives in his party.
I'm against it because it's a violation of the Constitution of the United States and of the Bill of Rights, and clearly so. I'm against it because it's immoral and nothing but totalitarianism itself. I'm against it because I know from a great many years' experience in the enforcement of the law that the proposal wouldn't work, and instead it would rapidly advance the cause of communism in the United States and all over the world.
And then, in his final rebuttal, Stassen makes a mistake that plays right into Dewey's hands.
Apparently we've narrowed this question down very much. It hinges now primarily on the Mundt-Nixon bill.
The Mundt-Nixon bill, sponsored by Representative Richard Nixon of California and Representative Carl Mundt of South Dakota, is currently before Congress. Stassen supports it.
The Mundt-Nixon bill says, "It shall be unlawful for any person to attempt in any manner to establish in the United States a totalitarian dictatorship." Now, I hold that that directly fits and applies to the Communist Party organization in the United States and in the world today.
Stassen has just made a colossal error. The Mundt-Nixon bill does not ban the communists by name. In his response, Dewey uses Stassen's ignorance to his advantage.
That the author of the bill, Mr. Mundt, the committee which sponsored it, both say in the official records of the Congress of the United States that the bill does not outlaw the Communist Party. Now, if Mr. Stassen says that that is all he wants, then he has completely surrendered, because he admits that he didn't mean it when he's been demanding from one end of this country to the other that the Communist Party be outlawed, and he's willing to settle now, when confronted with the facts, for a law which the author and the committees say does not outlaw the party, which of course it doesn't.
Dewey then points out that he agrees the Mundt-Nixon bill should pass, but only if it's constitutional.
The Mundt bill is perfectly harmless, probably. It may have the virtue of helping to keep them out in the open. That is a very good provision of law. The other parts of it, if they're constitutional, they're swell.
The Dewey-Stassen debate was the first nationally broadcast debate of presidential hopefuls in American history. 40 million Americans listened over the radio as Thomas Dewey unraveled Stassen's argument. Immediately following the debate, many commentators declared that the tide of the Republican primary was turning in Dewey's favor. 4 days later, Thomas Dewey won the Oregon primary. His path to nomination was wide open. But in the lead up to the convention, Dewey's rivals would form an alliance. They would set their differences aside and come together in a common purpose, denying Dewey the Republican nomination. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. The Republican National Convention began in June of 1948 at Philadelphia's Municipal Auditorium. The Dewey campaign team went all out. They printed a pamphlet titled The Philadelphia Story, which laid out Dewey's resume and his position on the issues. There was a Dewey sketchbook, Dewey neckties, Dewey cigarette lighters, Dewey buttons, and thousands of Dewey balloons with a candidate's face on them. Despite the fact that most party insiders considered Dewey the frontrunner, he still faced serious opposition at the convention. With Harold Stassen no longer a serious threat, Robert Taft was perhaps his biggest competitor. And on June 20th, one day before the convention, Taft made a big announcement. He told the press that he and Harold Stassen had formed an alliance and that together they were going to block Dewey from winning the nomination. After the Dewey-Stassen debate, Stassen's candidacy was all but over. He could not garner enough delegates to win the nomination, but he still had a swath of delegates pledged to his side, and he might be able to use them to help Taft eke out a victory. Republican Party leaders wanted a peaceful convention, and for good reason. The 1948 Republican Convention was broadcast over a new medium that was changing the face of communication, television. Though the new technological wonder was gaining popularity throughout the nation, its reach was regional and not yet national. But that didn't stop convention attendees' awareness of the cameras. They knew very well that television changed appearances. As Time magazine observed, good-looking women turn into witches, and dapper men become unshaven bums. And with the television broadcast of the 1948 Republican National Convention having the potential to reach 500,000 screens in the surrounding area, convention attendees were conscious of their looks. Thomas Dewey was fully aware of the potential impact of television. For decades, party leaders engaged in negotiations with delegates, sometimes out in the open, right on the convention floor. Dewey wisely instructed his managers to conduct all official campaign business away from the eyes of the cameras. Some of these out-of-sight negotiations took Stassen and Taft by surprise. In order for Stassen to block Dewey's path and help Taft take the nomination, the state of Pennsylvania was a must-win. Going into the convention, Pennsylvania was already firmly in the Taft column. But Stassen and Taft didn't anticipate Thomas Dewey's deft political maneuvering. On June 22, 1948, the state of Pennsylvania made a sudden announcement that took the convention by surprise. The Keystone State announced that it was switching its votes from Taft to Dewey. Afterwards, one delegate called it, "There goes the ball game." It's unclear exactly what Dewey traded away to secure Pennsylvania, but the story does reveal an important fact about the candidate. Dewey's political skill was not charming a crowd or shining in front of a camera. It was working the party machinery behind closed doors. At a press conference after the Pennsylvania announcement, when reporters asked Dewey how he felt, he answered with a smile and a short sentence. "I feel swell."
Convention will come to order. Upon this roll call, the delegates of this convention have cast 1,094 votes for Thomas E. Dewey of New York for President of the United States, and I declare that he is nominated unanimously for the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
Dewey won the Republican nomination on the third ballot. The party platform was a reflection of his policies, moderate and anti-isolationist. Dewey also made a wise pick for vice president, the popular California Governor Earl Warren, a future Supreme Court justice. Dewey didn't believe in passion or theatrics. He fought his battles thoughtfully and often through secret negotiation. His skills were enough to win the Republican primary, but would they be enough to overcome incumbent President Harry Truman? the Dewey campaign was confident they could, especially as they knew they weren't the only opposition President Truman was facing. In a lead-up to their 1948 convention, the Democratic coalition looked ready to splinter. To win the Democratic nomination for president, Truman would have to contend with two extreme factions in his own party, one from the right and one from the left. In the 1940s, the Democratic Party was teetering on the brink, in large part because many Democrats were fed up with Harry Truman. Fear of communist infiltration into American society was widespread. To many, President Truman's Truman Doctrine, which sought to use containment to prevent the further spread of communism internationally, was a failed policy. But for many progressives, Truman's stance on communism was far too harsh. And for many conservatives, Truman's nods to the issues of civil rights were a major cause for concern. And so in the 1948 election, Truman would have a fight on his hands. The first round was with his Commerce Secretary, Henry Wallace. By the standards of his day, Henry Wallace was extremely liberal. He had served as FDR's vice president, but eventually Wallace's pro-civil rights and pro-labor views had alienated him from many conservative Democrats, especially in the South. Ultimately, FDR had been forced to part ways with Wallace. In his place, he had selected Harry Truman as his running mate at the 1944 Democratic Convention. As a consolation prize, Wallace was named FDR's Commerce Secretary. For Truman, the first sign of trouble with Wallace had occurred back in 1946. Truman took a hard-line stance against the Soviets, believing America should compete with the USSR for global dominance. Wallace believed the two nations should coexist peacefully and that America should adopt a policy of cooperation. Wallace was far too vocal with these opinions for Truman's liking, and so Truman asked for his resignation. But unknowingly, by jettisoning Wallace, Truman had set the stage for a conflict in the 1948 election. It wasn't long before Wallace announced his intention to run as a presidential candidate for the newly revived Progressive Party. And throughout the spring and summer of 1948, Wallace's campaign picked up steam. The audiences at his rallies had steadily grown, as had the dollars he had managed to raise. But going into the Democratic National Convention in July of 1948, Henry Wallace wasn't Truman's biggest obstacle. That was overcoming opposition from his own party, especially Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats did not want Harry Truman, a man they saw as being too friendly to the issue of civil rights. And many progressive Democrats who had not joined Henry Wallace in the Progressive Party were eager for an alternative as well. For many, the answer was obvious: General Dwight D. Eisenhower, or as he's more commonly known, Ike. Ike was publicly a political agnostic, neither a committed Republican nor an affirmed Democrat. This fact alone made him dangerous, because Ike had the potential to build a bipartisan coalition. Additionally, Ike's heroic leadership in World War II had made him a household name. The American people knew him, and they trusted him. So the anti-Truman camp made appeals to the general. But luckily for Truman, Eisenhower did not want the job. On July 9, 1948, Ike released a statement saying in no uncertain terms that he would not accept the Democratic nomination for president, leaving Truman's path to the nomination looking clear. But days later, at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, the forces of opposition would make one last stand. Going into the convention, Truman and the Democratic leadership knew that a fight over civil rights was coming, and so did the Southern Democrats. Prior to the convention, the Alabama delegation had pledged that if the party adopted a civil rights plank in the platform, their delegates would walk out. Even so, the week before the convention, the committee in charge of the platform powered ahead with Truman's blessing and drafted a civil rights plank. The final version stated that the Democratic Party would work to eradicate all racial, religious, and economic discrimination. We again state our belief that racial and religious minorities have the right to live, the right to work, the right to vote, the full and equal protection of the law. When the plank was read aloud at the convention, Southern delegates immediately pushed back. One Mississippi delegate called out, "Give us the right to govern our own fundamental affairs." Minneapolis Mayor Hubert Humphrey, an author of the Civil Rights Plank, didn't back down. "I say the time has come to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the sunlight of human rights." Southern delegates argued that the plank was too much change too fast. Humphrey responded, "To those who say that we are rushing the issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late." The civil rights plank passed 682 to 651. Alabama walked out first, then Mississippi. To the sound of boos and hisses, the delegates ripped off their badges and tossed them aside. The rest of the Southern delegation stayed, albeit begrudgingly. The Southerners put forth a protest candidate, but it was a futile resistance. Harry Truman won the nomination on the first ballot. But to pacify the embittered Southerners, and in an attempt to foster party unity, Truman selected Kentucky Senator Alban W. Barkley as his running mate. But party unity would be hard to come by. On the night of Truman's acceptance speech, all hell would break loose. It's July 1948. The delegates of the Democratic National Convention are crammed into Philadelphia's convention hall. It's late and the delegates are exhausted. Two Democrats stand near the front of the stage, DNC official Jack Redding and Ohio Congressman Mike Kerwin, whose face is dripping with sweat. Oh, it is hot as Hades in here. 100 degrees at least. I'm swimming in my own sweat. Well, who isn't? Outside, the summer heat is sweltering. Inside the hall, the only thing more pronounced than the heat is the tension. Harry Truman has won the nomination, but the path to victory was deeply contentious. Soon, Truman will make his acceptance speech, but before he does, party leaders have a special event planned. Convention Chairman Sam Rayburn takes the stage and speaks into the microphone.
Distinguished delegates, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mrs. Emma Guffey Miller.
Miller, the sister of a well-known Democratic senator, is hoping to lighten the mood. Emma commissioned the Pennsylvania Florist Association to make a surprise for President Truman, a massive Liberty Bell made out of flowers that weighs nearly 150 pounds. The bell sits on stage for all the delegates to see. As Miller walks onto the platform, the crowd goes wild. The two men near the front of the stage turn their attention from the heat to the flowers. What's this all about? Oh, you just wait and see. Mrs. Miller has a surprise in store for us. What kind of surprise? Pigeons. Kerwin seems confused. But on the last break, Redding saw the pigeons himself, hidden away in secret compartments inside the Liberty Bell. Before Redding has a chance to explain, Mrs. Miller waves her hand and gives a secret signal. The trapdoor releases and nearly 40 pigeons take flight. But immediately, Mrs. Miller notices something is wrong. Two of the pigeons are dead in their cages from the heat, and the lucky survivors don't make an orderly exit. Most fly to the rafters, but a handful go berserk. One of the pigeons lands on Chairman Rayburn's head. He swats it away, screaming. Other pigeons fly right over the heads of delegates, leaving splatters of droppings in their wake. People scream, shout, duck to the ground, and cover their heads to prevent the pigeons from pecking their eyes out. Jack Redding shakes his head in disbelief. He's the DNC publicist, but he had nothing to do with this preposterous stunt. He turns to Congressman Kerwin. And what damn fool could have thought of a thing like this? In this heat, they could all be dead. It's bad enough having the Southerners and the Wallaceites after us. Now we got to have someone arrange for the SPCA to have at us. The unleashing of the pigeons from Mrs. Miller's Liberty Bell was meant to be a celebration, but the chaos that ensued was perhaps a portent of what was to come. In July, the same month as the Democratic Convention, the Progressive Party met in Philadelphia and officially nominated Henry Wallace. Days later, the Democrats who had walked out held a convention of their own in Birmingham, Alabama. There, the newly formed States' Rights Party, commonly known as the Dixiecrats, nominated the fiery South Carolina Governor J. Strom Thurmond. While the Progressives called for an end to the Cold War, the Dixiecrats defended segregation, condemned federal encroachment into states' rights. For Truman, this month of July was a disaster. His party had splintered into 3 factions, and a much-needed post-convention bump in the polls never came. So by the end of July, Thomas Dewey was well ahead in every national poll. Many in the press pronounced Truman's candidacy dead, and many in the Truman administration lost hope. But Harry Truman did not. As the fall campaign got underway in earnest, Truman would try to inject his staff with a shot of optimism, and he would attempt to pull off one of the greatest upset victories in the history of presidential elections. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. It's late July 1948 at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The mood at the White House is frantic but somber. The national polls show Thomas Dewey with a commanding lead, and most Washington insiders agree Truman's candidacy is doomed. Truman and his staff gather in the Oval Room to discuss the upcoming presidential contest. As the staffers go back and forth strategizing and analyzing his prospects for victory, Truman sits at his desk quietly taking it all in. He senses more than discouragement from the group. He senses defeat. Concerned, Truman listens intently as one of his staffers talks to his press secretary and close friend, Charlie Ross. "I think it's hopeless, Charlie. Nothing is hopeless. No, we have no chance of winning, none at all. The best we can do is go down fighting." Hearing this, Truman suddenly stands. The room falls to a hush. All turn to the president. He speaks in a firm and steady voice. "We are going to win." Truman is not the sort of man to accept defeat. He slowly walks around to the front of his desk. With determination in his eyes and intensity in his voice, he proceeds to rally the troops. "I expect to travel all across this country. I expect to talk at every whistle stop. We're going to be on the road from Labor Day to the end of the campaign." Truman stares the defeated staffer down. "It's going to be tough on everybody, but that's the way it's got to be. I know I can take it." Then Truman flashes a slight grin. With a twinkle in his eye, he turns to address the whole room. "I'm only afraid I'll kill some of my staff, and I like you all very much. I don't want to do that." Charlie Ross liked to say that as far as he was concerned, the election of 1948 was won that day in the Oval Room. Truman's daughter Margaret had a theory about where her father's optimism came from. In her book, Harry Truman, Margaret recounts a letter her father sent to his sister earlier that year. In the letter, President Truman wrote, "Just 3 years ago, I was sworn in as president. Seems an age, and it has been. 2 wars were in progress. We were supporting both. I ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a terrible decision, but I made it. And I'd make it again to save 250,000 boys from the United States. I've still a long way to go. It will be a rough road. It can't be any worse than the trail behind." According to his daughter Margaret, Truman felt he had to win. The fate of the world hung in the balance. Earlier in the year, Truman had written, "If it were not for the world situation and my lack of confidence in the presidential candidates, I'd throw the whole works out the window and go home." And stay there. At the 1948 Democratic Convention, Truman had vowed to fight hard and give the Republicans hell. On the campaign trail at 64 years old, Truman did just that. In September and October of 1948, Truman traveled over 20,000 miles by train, giving speeches, as many as 10 per day. His large crowds frequently chanted, "Give 'em hell, Harry." On the campaign trail, Truman promised to give hell to the communists, too. And he blamed the Republican-controlled Congress for forcing him to confront the issue with one hand tied behind his back. To a crowd of thousands in Oklahoma City, Truman decried, "I charge that the Republicans have impeded and made more difficult our efforts to cope with communism in this country." Truman urged the Oklahoma audience not to sit at home, but go out and vote. Truman attacked the do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republicans mercilessly, calling them bloodsuckers and gluttons of privilege. To appeal to progressive New Deal Democrats, Truman slammed Republicans for their anti-labor positions, as Truman called for instituting fair labor laws and raising the minimum wage. But despite Truman's heroic efforts, Thomas Dewey was still ahead in the polls. A Gallup poll in October showed Dewey with a comfortable lead, 49.5% to Truman's 44.5%. In the final weeks of the campaign, major newspapers across the country declared that Dewey's victory was all but certain. Life magazine ran a picture of Dewey with the caption, "The next President of the United States." The Chicago Tribune was so confident of Dewey's victory that on election night they went to press early, running the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." It's become one of the most famous printing errors in American history. On Election Day in 1948, Harry Truman won over 24 million popular votes and 303 electoral votes, defeating Dewey, who received just under 22 million popular votes and 189 electoral votes. The Democrats fared well across the board, reclaiming the House and the Senate. 2 days later, one of the 150,000 copies of the erroneously headlined Chicago Tribune made its way into the hands of Harry Truman, who stood on the back of a train car in St. Louis. The Tribune had previously written off Truman, calling him a nincompoop. On the back of that train car, Truman had his revenge. He held up a copy of the paper and smiled as a slew of photographers captured the moment and the Tribune's egregious mistake for history. In the 1948 election, progressive Democrats, mainly farmers, laborers, and union workers, largely voted for Truman. Truman also received a larger portion of the African-American vote than FDR. And most significantly, Truman's victory proved that a Democrat could win the White House without a solid South standing behind him. If the Dixiecrats had not defected from the Democratic Party, Truman's margin of victory would have been even bigger. Strom Thurmond won 39 electoral votes that likely would have gone to Truman. Progressive candidate Henry Wallace received none. In the end, it might be said that the 1948 election came down to personality. Truman had the pluck of an underdog, the fight of a man with nothing to lose. These qualities endeared him to the American people. Dewey, on the other hand, was careful with his words to such an extreme that he often came off as bland, unapproachable, and stiff. As one contemporary observer noted, Dewey was like the little man on the wedding cake. In addition, Truman's was arguably the better campaign. His Fair Deal for America, which advocated for universal health care and a raised minimum wage, had delivered the people hope, and his Truman Doctrine against communism made many Americans feel that they were in safe hands. But during his first elected term, Truman's hard line on communism would be put to the test. The tension of the Cold War would intensify, and in a surprise move, the USSR would successfully detonate their own atomic bomb. Communists would gain control in China, and a bloody conflict in Korea would turn into a protracted quagmire. Truman's popularity would plummet, and as the Democrats searched for a new leader, the Republicans would try to rise to power on the back of a famous World War II general, Dwight D. Eisenhower. But in the 1952 contest, for the Republican establishment, Ike would prove difficult to control. This is episode 41 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1948, Gangbuster. On the next episode, the election of 1952, Dwight Ike Eisenhower takes on a determined Democratic Party united behind the popular Illinois governor Adlai Stevenson. But in the run-up to the 1952 contest, Ike's biggest cross to bear is not the Democrats, it's a member of his own party. As Ike defies the Republican establishment and fights for the White House on his own terms, he does his best to rein in his vice presidential running mate, a political powerhouse named Richard Nixon. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.